The cold morning air hung heavy over the Cherokee Nation in the winter of 1838. Smoke rose gently from cabin chimneys. Children laughed while chasing each other between wooden homes. The elders prepared food. Hunters cleaned their gear. It was an ordinary morning, or at least it felt like one. Then the soldiers arrived. Boots crushed frozen dirt as United States troops marched into Cherokee villages without warning. Armed men surrounded homes. Families stepped outside, confused, terrified, and unprepared. Some thought it was just another government announcement. Others feared something far worse. They were right to be afraid. The soldiers carried orders, not requests, not negotiations, orders. Every Cherokee family was told to leave immediately. They could carry only what they could hold in their hands. Homes, farms, sacred lands, and generations of memories had to be abandoned in moments. Anyone who resisted was threatened at gunpoint. This moment would become the beginning of one of the darkest forced migrations in American history. The Trail of Tears. Before we continue uncovering this forgotten tragedy, welcome to Canon of Darkness, where history's hidden shadows are revealed. If stories like this matter to you, make sure you subscribe and stay with us until the end, because some truths deserve to be remembered. For centuries, the Cherokee people had lived across the fertile lands of Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and North Carolina. They built farms, schools, and even created their own written language. Many Cherokee families had adopted farming techniques, written laws, and democratic leadership systems similar to the United States itself. They believed coexistence was possible. But everything changed when gold was discovered in Georgia during the late 1820s. Suddenly, the land wasn't just home anymore. It became valuable property in the eyes of American settlers. Pressure began building against Native American tribes. Settlers demanded control of the land. Politicians listened. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, allowing the government to relocate native tribes west of the Mississippi River. The Cherokee Nation refused to surrender peacefully. They fought using the American legal system, bringing their case all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And in a shocking decision, the court ruled in favor of the Cherokee, recognizing their sovereignty. For a brief moment, it seemed justice had prevailed. But justice would not protect them. President Jackson reportedly ignored the ruling. The government moved forward with removal plans anyway. By 1838, federal troops were sent to enforce relocation. Over 16,000 Cherokee people were rounded up and forced into detention camps before being marched west toward unfamiliar territory in present-day Oklahoma. Families were separated during the arrests. Mothers lost sight of children in the chaos. Elders who couldn't move quickly enough were dragged from their homes. Some people were given only minutes to leave everything behind. Pets were abandoned. Crops rotted in fields. Entire communities vanished overnight. What made the situation even more devastating was the Cherokee people's belief that the United States would honor its laws and treaties. They had trusted the system. That trust would soon turn into heartbreak. As winter approached, the forced march began. Thousands of men, women, and children started walking nearly 1,200 miles across freezing terrain with limited supplies, poor clothing, and almost no medical care. Many would not survive the journey, and as the first Cherokee groups stepped onto the icy roads under military guard, none of them knew that this march would soon transform into a nightmare that would claim thousands of lives, including the youngest and the oldest among them. But the most terrifying part of this story hasn't even begun yet. The roundups happened fast, but the suffering that followed moved painfully slow. After being forced out of their homes, thousands of Cherokee men, women, and children were driven into makeshift detention camps guarded by U.S. soldiers. These camps were never meant to hold entire communities, yet over 16,000 people were crowded into tight, unsanitary enclosures surrounded by fences and armed patrols. What was supposed to be a temporary stop quickly became a breeding ground for fear and disease. Families were packed into small spaces with barely enough room to sleep. Clean drinking water was scarce. Food was inconsistent and often spoiled by the time it arrived. As days stretched into weeks, illness began spreading rapidly through the camps. Measles, whooping cough, dysentery, pneumonia. Children were the first to fall sick. Their immune systems couldn't handle the harsh living conditions. Mothers watched helplessly as their sons and daughters developed fevers that never broke. Elders, already weakened by age, struggled to survive without proper shelter or medicine. Death became an uninvited visitor that returned every day. Burials were rushed and often incomplete. In some cases, families were not even allowed time to perform traditional funeral ceremonies. Sacred rituals that honored the spirits of the departed were replaced by hurried graves dug under military supervision. The Cherokee people believed their ancestors' spirits guided them and protected their future generations. Now, those spirits were being buried in foreign soil without respect, leaving survivors with an unbearable sense of loss. Meanwhile, government officials argued about logistics, transportation costs, and scheduling delays. To them, the Cherokee removal was an operation that needed to stay on budget and on time. To the Cherokee families trapped behind fences, it was the collapse of their entire world. Some Cherokee leaders begged for more preparation time. They requested wagons, supplies, and safer travel arrangements. A few U.S. military officers even expressed concern about the terrible conditions inside the camps. But pressure from Washington pushed the process forward. The government wanted relocation completed quickly, regardless of human cost. As summer turned into fall, conditions inside the camps worsened. Rain turned the ground into thick mud, contaminating water sources. Malnutrition weakened entire families. Rumors spread among detainees that the journey west would begin soon, and many feared they were too weak to survive it. One Cherokee woman later described the camps as places where hope slowly disappeared. She remembered hearing crying throughout the night as parents held sick children, praying they would see another sunrise. Not everyone stayed silent. Some Cherokee individuals attempted to escape under the cover of darkness. A few managed to slip past guards and disappear into nearby forests. Others were captured and punished severely as warnings to those who might try to flee. The soldiers were given strict orders. No one was allowed to leave. By early autumn of 1838, federal authorities decided the waiting period had lasted long enough. The Cherokee detainees were divided into multiple groups and organized into travel detachments. Each group would be forced to travel west under military escort. The Cherokee people had hoped detention was the worst part of their nightmare. They were wrong, because when the first detachment stepped out of the camps and onto the long western road, they were about to face freezing storms, starvation, and exhaustion that would turn this forced relocation into one of the deadliest marches in American history. And the very first steps of that journey would reveal a level of suffering no one inside those camps was prepared to endure. In the fall of 1838, the first Cherokee detachments were ordered to leave the detention camps and begin the journey west. Soldiers lined the pathways as families were pushed forward in organized columns. The march was not optional.
It was a command backed by rifles, bayonets, and strict military discipline. Each group was made up of hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 people. They were told to travel nearly 1,200 miles to a new land west of the Mississippi River, a place most of them had never seen and knew nothing about. They stepped onto the road carrying blankets, cooking tools, and whatever small belongings they had managed to keep. Many carried infants, others supported elderly relatives who could barely stand. Wagons were limited, and most people had no choice but to walk. At first, some believed the journey might not be as deadly as they feared. The early autumn air was still manageable, and a few detachments tried to stay hopeful. Cherokee leaders attempted to organize their people, creating walking schedules and assigning individuals to gather food or assist the sick. But hope began fading faster than expected. Government rations were inconsistent and often insufficient. Cornmeal and salt pork were handed out irregularly. Sometimes supplies arrived spoiled or too small to feed entire groups. Hunger quickly weakened travelers, especially children and elders who required steady nourishment. The roads themselves became enemies.
The marching routes passed through rough terrain, muddy trails, and rocky hills. When rainstorms hit, pathways turned into deep, slippery swamps. Wagons broke down, shoes tore apart. Many travelers wrapped their feet in scraps of cloth or animal skins to protect themselves from sharp stones and frozen ground. Every mile demanded physical strength that thousands simply did not have. Illness continued spreading as the march progressed. Without proper sanitation, drinking water was often contaminated. Entire detachments experienced outbreaks of disease that moved faster than the soldiers escorting them. Coughing, fever, and severe dehydration became common sights along the trail. When someone collapsed from exhaustion, the group faced impossible decisions. Stopping too long risked punishment from guards or falling behind schedule. Moving forward meant leaving loved ones struggling to stand. Some families carried sick relatives for miles until their own strength failed, and winter was approaching. As temperatures dropped, Cherokee travelers lacked proper winter clothing. Many still wore garments suited for warmer southern climates. Cold winds cut through thin fabric, causing frostbite and severe respiratory illness. Nighttime conditions became especially dangerous as families slept on frozen ground with limited shelter. Despite their suffering, Cherokee spiritual leaders tried to keep cultural traditions alive during the march. They whispered prayers during rest stops. They shared songs quietly around weak campfires. These small acts became emotional lifelines, reminding survivors of their identity while everything else was being stripped away. Meanwhile, U.S. soldiers escorting the detachments faced their own moral conflict. Some followed orders without hesitation. Others secretly sympathized with the Cherokee, but feared punishment if they showed compassion. A few soldiers allowed short rest breaks or shared small portions of food, but these rare moments barely slowed the suffering. By late November, the journey turned even more dangerous as early snowstorms struck the marching routes. Ice covered river crossings. Travelers slipped and fell into freezing water while attempting to cross makeshift bridges or shallow passages. Hypothermia claimed lives overnight. The Cherokee people had already lost homes, land, and security. Now they were beginning to lose entire families along the road.
And as the detachments pushed deeper into unfamiliar territory, a brutal winter storm system was forming ahead, one that would trap thousands of Cherokee travelers in conditions so severe that survival itself would become uncertain. By December of 1838, the Trail of Tears had transformed from a forced migration into a desperate fight for survival. The Cherokee detachments were now deep into unfamiliar territories, moving farther away from everything they had ever known. As winter tightened its hold across the land, the journey became nearly unbearable. Snow began falling in heavy, relentless waves. The once muddy trails hardened into frozen paths that cut into bare and bleeding feet. Strong northern winds tore through thin clothing, leaving travelers shivering through both day and night. Many Cherokee families had never experienced such brutal winter conditions, especially while traveling without shelter. The cold didn't just cause discomfort, it killed. Travelers who stopped moving for too long risked freezing where they sat. Parents wrapped children in their own blankets, sacrificing their warmth in hopes their sons and daughters might survive. Some elders insisted younger family members take their coats, quietly accepting their own fate in the icy air. Frostbite spread quickly. Fingers and toes turned numb before darkening and dying. Many walkers could no longer feel their feet, forcing them to march blindly through pain that would permanently cripple them if they survived at all. Food shortages grew worse with every passing mile. Supply wagons struggled to reach the detachments due to snow-blocked routes and broken equipment. Hunting opportunities were nearly impossible in the frozen wilderness. Families were forced to ration tiny portions of cornmeal or salted meat, stretching meals over several days. Starvation weakened entire groups, making them vulnerable to illness.
Respiratory infections surged as freezing winds damaged lungs already exhausted by constant travel. Coughing fits echoed through nighttime camps as families huddled together for warmth. Mothers tried to keep children alive by holding them close through freezing nights, sometimes waking at sunrise only to realize the child in their arms had stopped breathing hours earlier. Burials became more heartbreaking during winter. Frozen ground made digging graves nearly impossible. Survivors often used axes or heavy tools to break through layers of ice-covered soil. Some families were forced to leave loved ones wrapped in blankets along the trail, marking locations with stones or tree carvings, hoping one day they could return to honor them properly. The emotional toll shattered spirits just as much as the physical suffering. Cherokee travelers began losing track of time as days blended into endless walking and survival routines. Some spoke of hearing voices carried through winter winds, believing ancestors were calling them home. Others simply walked in silence, too exhausted to speak or even cry. Despite these overwhelming conditions, Cherokee leaders continued trying to maintain order and unity. They adjusted travel schedules to allow slightly longer rest periods, though this often angered military escorts, demanding strict progress. The leaders understood that moving too slowly risked punishment, but moving too quickly guaranteed more deaths. Tension between soldiers and Cherokee groups occasionally escalated. Some guards forced detachments to continue marching during severe weather, while others quietly allowed short breaks, knowing many travelers would not survive without them. River crossings became particularly deadly during winter. Ice formed fragile layers across water, tempting groups to cross quickly. Many travelers fell through cracking surfaces, plunging into freezing currents that stole body heat within minutes. Those who managed to escape the water rarely survived long afterward due to hypothermia. By late December, the detachments were surrounded by relentless snowstorms that slowed progress to a crawl. Entire groups became stranded for days without supplies, trapped in open landscapes with no permanent shelter. For many Cherokee families, hope had become a fading memory. Survival now depended on strength, luck, and the determination to protect loved ones at any cost. Yet even as winter crushed their bodies and spirits, the most devastating losses of the Trail of Tears were still waiting ahead. As the brutal winter dragged on, the physical suffering along the Trail of Tears began creating another kind of devastation: the destruction of families. The Cherokee people had always relied on strong family bonds and community unity to survive hardship. Along this forced march, those bonds were being shattered mile by mile. The detachments were massive, often stretching across long sections of road. Snowstorms, sickness, and exhaustion caused constant delays, forcing military escorts to split groups apart to maintain marching schedules. Husbands were separated from wives. Parents lost sight of children in the chaos. Siblings who had walked together for days suddenly found themselves pushed into different detachments without warning. Reuniting was nearly impossible once separation occurred. Some Cherokee families tried tying pieces of cloth to each other's clothing to stay connected in crowded marching lines. Others held hands while walking through snow-covered trails, refusing to let go even as soldiers ordered them to move faster. But when illness or injury slowed one family member down, the rest faced an impossible choice: stay behind and risk punishment, or move forward and lose their loved one forever. Many never saw each other again. Children became especially vulnerable during these separations. Young travelers often lacked the strength to keep pace with adult marching speeds. When they collapsed from exhaustion, older siblings or parents attempted to carry them. As days passed and physical strength faded, some families were forced to leave children in the care of strangers or distant relatives within the detachments, hoping someone stronger could keep them alive. There were heartbreaking moments when children woke up during rest stops only to realize their parents had died during the night. Others wandered through camps searching for missing relatives, calling names that would never be answered. Cherokee oral histories later described these scenes as emotional wounds that never healed. Survivors carried memories of losing family members in confusion and fear, haunted by the final moments they could not change.
Marriage traditions and cultural roles also suffered. Cherokee society valued extended family systems where elders guided younger generations. Along the trail, many elders died from cold and illness, removing the wisdom and leadership that held communities together. Young adults were suddenly forced into leadership roles they were never prepared for, trying to protect younger children while grieving their own losses. The forced migration also disrupted Cherokee spiritual traditions connected to family ancestry. The Cherokee believed their connection to ancestors came from burial grounds located in their homeland. As family members died along the trail and were buried in unfamiliar land, survivors feared they were losing spiritual guidance that had protected their people for generations. Emotional despair began spreading just as rapidly as disease. Some travelers fell into deep silence, barely speaking for days. Others expressed anger toward soldiers escorting them, sometimes risking violent punishment. A few Cherokee individuals reportedly collapsed from emotional shock after witnessing the death of multiple family members in a single week. Yet even within overwhelming tragedy, acts of compassion continued to appear. Strangers adopted orphaned children into their walking groups. Mothers who had lost their own children shared food and blankets with others. Community bonds shifted from blood relationships to survival alliances, forming fragile support systems that helped some travelers keep moving forward. Still, the cost was unbearable. By early 1839, death had become so common along the Trail of Tears that some detachments began losing count of the bodies left behind. Entire family lines disappeared before reaching their destination. Survivors later struggled to remember exactly when or where their loved ones were lost.
The Cherokee people had entered the journey as organized communities built on deep family connections. Now they were becoming scattered survivors, carrying grief that would follow them for the rest of their lives. And as the detachments moved closer to the Mississippi River, one of the most dangerous crossings of the entire journey, thousands of exhausted travelers were about to face a deadly obstacle that would claim even more lives before they could reach the other side. By early 1839, the surviving Cherokee detachments approached one of the most terrifying obstacles of the entire journey, the Mississippi River. This massive waterway stood between them and the unfamiliar territory they were being forced to call their new home. Under normal conditions, crossing such a river would already be dangerous. During the freezing winter of the Trail of Tears, it became a deadly gamble. The river stretched wide and powerful, carrying chunks of floating ice across its dark, rushing surface. Strong currents made navigation unpredictable. The Cherokee travelers, already weakened by starvation, disease, and exhaustion, now faced the terrifying reality of crossing waters that could kill them within minutes.
Government officials and military escorts struggled to organize transportation across the river. Ferries and flatboats were limited, forcing thousands of people to wait for days, sometimes weeks, in exposed camps along the frozen riverbanks. Supplies ran dangerously low during these delays, pushing many travelers closer to starvation. The waiting period itself became deadly. Freezing winds blew across the open river, lowering body temperatures rapidly. Families huddled together, using shared blankets and small fires to survive the brutal nights. Some travelers built temporary shelters using broken wagons, tree branches, or scraps of fabric, but these offered little protection against the harsh environment. As detachments slowly began crossing, panic and tragedy followed. Overcrowded boats were often pushed beyond safe limits. Travelers packed tightly together while trying to hold on to children, elderly relatives, and their few remaining possessions. Ice floating through the river occasionally struck ferry boats, causing them to tilt dangerously or stall mid-crossing. In several documented cases, boats capsized in the freezing water. Passengers thrown into the river struggled desperately to swim while wearing heavy clothing soaked with icy water. Most could not stay afloat for long. Hypothermia set in within minutes, causing muscles to stiffen and breathing to fail. Witnesses described hearing screams carried across the river as families watched loved ones disappear beneath the surface, powerless to help. Some Cherokee groups were forced to cross the river on foot when ice temporarily formed thick layers across sections of the water. Soldiers urged them to move quickly before the ice broke. Entire detachments walked cautiously across frozen surfaces, each step carrying the risk of collapse. In several tragic incidents, ice shattered beneath travelers, sending groups plunging into freezing currents. Those who survived such falls rarely lived much longer due to severe hypothermia and lung infections. Adding to the chaos, communication between detachments often failed during the crossing process. Family members separated during earlier stages of the journey became permanently lost if they boarded different boats or crossed at different times. Some survivors spent years searching for relatives they believed might have crossed safely somewhere else along the river. For many Cherokee travelers, the Mississippi River symbolized a final, irreversible separation from their homeland. Standing on the riverbank, survivors could still look eastward toward the lands where their ancestors had lived for centuries. Once they crossed, there would be no return. Spiritual leaders quietly performed prayers during the crossings, asking ancestral spirits for protection. Many travelers carried small, sacred objects hidden in their clothing, believing these items might guide them through the deadly waters.
These rituals provided emotional strength, but they could not stop the freezing river from claiming more lives. After weeks of chaotic and dangerous crossings, the surviving detachments finally reached the western side of the Mississippi. But survival did not bring relief.
The land waiting ahead was unfamiliar, poorly prepared for settlement, and filled with new challenges the Cherokee people had never faced. And as the survivors stepped onto this unknown territory, they were about to discover that reaching their destination would not end their suffering. It would only begin a new and devastating chapter of loss, survival, and uncertain future. When the surviving Cherokee detachments finally crossed the Mississippi River, many believed the worst part of their suffering was behind them. They had survived freezing storms, starvation, disease, and deadly river crossings. Stepping onto the western side of the river felt like reaching the end of a nightmare. But the land waiting for them was not the safe refuge they had been promised. The territory in present-day Oklahoma looked unfamiliar and harsh compared to the fertile, forested homelands they had lost. The environment was drastically different. The soil was harder and less reliable for farming. Water sources were unpredictable. Weather patterns were extreme, shifting quickly between dry heat and sudden storms. Government officials had described this new territory as suitable and prepared for settlement. The reality shocked the Cherokee survivors. There were very few established shelters. Food supplies waiting for them were far below what had been promised. Medical support was almost non-existent. Entire detachments arrived exhausted, sick, and emotionally broken, only to realize they would need to build a new life immediately just to survive. Disease continued spreading through the weakened population. Malnutrition, exposure, and untreated infections from the journey followed survivors into the new territory. Many who had survived the Trail of Tears died shortly after arrival due to poor living conditions and lack of care. Cherokee families who had already lost relatives during the Trail of Tears now faced even more funerals in unfamiliar land. The psychological trauma weighed heavily on survivors. Many Cherokee individuals struggled to accept that their homeland, sacred burial grounds, and cultural landmarks were permanently gone. Oral histories later described survivors walking through the new territory feeling spiritually disconnected, as if they had been separated from the roots that defined their identity. Cultural survival became just as important as physical survival. Cherokee leaders quickly realized they needed to rebuild their government and social systems to prevent total collapse of their nation. Despite enormous grief, they began organizing councils, creating temporary housing settlements, and redistributing limited supplies among survivors. But rebuilding unity proved difficult. Tensions developed between different Cherokee groups, especially between those who had signed earlier treaties supporting relocation and those who had strongly opposed leaving their homeland. Some survivors blamed certain leaders for the forced removal, creating internal divisions that threatened the fragile rebuilding process. These political conflicts made recovery even harder. Meanwhile, neighboring Native American tribes already living in the territory were also struggling with limited resources. Competition for land, water, and hunting areas created additional stress for Cherokee survivors trying to establish stability. Relationships between tribes required careful negotiation to avoid new conflicts. The loss of cultural landmarks remained one of the most painful realities. Sacred mountains, ceremonial gathering areas, and ancestral burial sites had all been left behind. Cherokee spiritual practices deeply connected to those locations now had to be adapted to an entirely different environment. Some elders feared that future generations might lose connection to their heritage completely. Yet, even in overwhelming grief, the Cherokee people demonstrated extraordinary resilience. Survivors began building homes from scratch. They planted crops in unfamiliar soil.
Teachers and elders started educating younger generations to preserve Cherokee language and traditions. Community gatherings slowly returned, offering emotional support and reminding survivors that their identity still existed.
Still, the emotional scars from the Trail of Tears remained fresh. Every new home built in the Western Territory carried memories of homes lost in the East. Every child born into the new land represented survival, but also the painful cost paid by those who never reached it. The Cherokee Nation had reached its destination, but the true challenge of rebuilding a shattered civilization was only beginning. And as survivors struggled to rebuild their nation from tragedy, internal betrayal, political conflict, and lasting grief, would soon create another crisis that threatened to divide the Cherokee people even further. The Cherokee people had survived the Trail of Tears, but survival did not bring peace. As families tried rebuilding their lives in the unfamiliar Western Territory, deep divisions began forming within their own nation. The forced removal had not only taken land and lives, it had shattered trust among the Cherokee themselves. Long before the forced march began, disagreements about how to deal with the United States government had already created tension inside the Cherokee Nation. Some leaders believed negotiating with American officials was the only way to protect their people. Others insisted that any agreement involving removal from their homeland was a betrayal of their ancestors and future generations. These disagreements exploded into open conflict after relocation. Years earlier, a small group of Cherokee leaders had signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835. This treaty agreed to give up Cherokee land in exchange for money and territory in the West. The problem was that the majority of Cherokee citizens, including Principal Chief John Ross, strongly opposed the treaty and argued it was signed without proper authority. Despite massive protests from the Cherokee Nation, the United States government used that treaty as legal justification for the forced removal that followed.
When survivors finally reached the Western Territory, anger toward the treaty signers reached a dangerous level. Many Cherokee believed those leaders were responsible for the deaths of thousands during the Trail of Tears. Grief turned into resentment. Resentment turned into calls for justice or revenge. The Cherokee Nation now faced an internal crisis that threatened to destroy what remained of their unity. By 1839, tensions reached a breaking point. Several prominent Cherokee figures who had signed or supported the Treaty of New Echota were assassinated. Among them was Major Ridge, one of the treaty's most visible supporters. His son, John Ridge, and another treaty advocate, Elias Boudinot, were also killed in coordinated attacks. These assassinations shocked the Cherokee Nation. Survivors who had just escaped one of the deadliest forced migrations in American history were now witnessing violence among their own people. The murders created fear and instability throughout Cherokee settlements. Some families supported the actions, believing justice had finally been served for the suffering caused by the treaty. Others feared the violence would trigger endless retaliation, destroying the fragile rebuilding efforts already underway. Principal Chief John Ross, who had opposed the treaty, found himself in a nearly impossible position. He needed to unite a broken nation while preventing further bloodshed. Ross encouraged reconciliation and attempted to stabilize Cherokee leadership, but emotional wounds from the Trail of Tears ran too deep for quick healing. The internal conflict slowed the rebuilding of government systems, economic development, and cultural recovery.
Communities that needed cooperation for survival were now divided by mistrust. Political disagreements turned into personal feuds. Some Cherokee feared that these divisions could weaken their ability to defend their new territory from outside threats. Meanwhile, the United States government observed these internal struggles without offering meaningful support. Many federal officials considered relocation complete and viewed Cherokee internal conflict as their own problem to resolve. Despite the violence and division, Cherokee elders and spiritual leaders continued urging their people to remember their shared identity. They organized community gatherings focused on cultural traditions, language preservation, and spiritual healing. These efforts aimed to remind survivors that unity was the only way to protect their future. Still, grief from lost homelands, broken treaties, and thousands of deaths lingered in every Cherokee settlement. The Trail of Tears had ended physically, but emotionally and politically, its damage was still unfolding. And as the Cherokee Nation struggled to heal from betrayal within, they were about to face another painful reality. The long-term consequences of the Trail of Tears would shape generations of Native American life in ways no one could yet imagine. As the Cherokee Nation struggled to rebuild in the Western Territory, the effects of the Trail of Tears did not end with the survivors who walked the deadly route. The tragedy planted deep emotional and cultural scars that would pass from one generation to the next, shaping the future of the Cherokee people in ways few outsiders understood. The children who arrived in the new territory carried memories that no child should ever experience. Many had watched parents, siblings, or grandparents die during the march. Others had grown up hearing stories of lost homelands they would never see. These memories created a powerful sense of grief that followed them into adulthood. Trauma became part of their identity. Parents who survived the journey often struggled to talk about the horrors they had witnessed. Some avoided discussing the Trail of Tears completely, hoping silence might protect their children from pain. Others shared detailed accounts, believing future generations needed to remember the truth to prevent history from repeating itself.
This emotional divide created complicated family dynamics. Some Cherokee children grew up knowing every detail of the tragedy. Others sensed their parents' sorrow but never fully understood its cause, leaving them with unanswered questions and inherited grief. Cultural survival became one of the greatest challenges facing the Cherokee Nation. The forced removal had separated the people from sacred landscapes, burial grounds, and traditional gathering places that had shaped their spiritual identity for centuries. Without access to those locations, elders feared important traditions might slowly disappear. Language preservation became especially urgent. The Cherokee language, once widely spoken across their eastern homeland, faced growing pressure as survivors adapted to new environments influenced by American government systems. Schools established by federal authorities often encouraged English instruction while discouraging native languages. Many Cherokee leaders resisted these pressures by creating community-based education programs designed to teach younger generations their original language and traditions. Despite their efforts, maintaining cultural identity became an uphill battle. Economic struggles also affected future generations. The new territory offered fewer natural resources compared to their original homeland. Farming proved difficult due to unfamiliar soil conditions and unpredictable weather patterns. Limited economic stability forced many Cherokee families into poverty, restricting educational opportunities and healthcare access for their children. Meanwhile, U.S. expansion continued spreading westward, bringing new settlers, infrastructure, and political pressures into the region. Cherokee communities found themselves constantly negotiating for land rights, legal recognition, and protection of their sovereignty. The fear of losing their new territory never fully disappeared, keeping memories of forced removal painfully alive. Yet resilience remained deeply rooted within Cherokee culture. Elders organized storytelling gatherings where survivors shared their experiences with younger listeners. These stories were not told to reopen wounds, but to preserve historical truth and strengthen cultural pride.
Traditional ceremonies slowly returned, adapted to the new land while maintaining their spiritual significance. Music, dance, and oral storytelling became powerful tools for emotional healing and cultural survival. Cherokee leaders also rebuilt their constitutional government, establishing schools, courts, and public institutions that reflected their determination to remain a strong and organized nation. These accomplishments demonstrated that despite unimaginable suffering, the Cherokee people refused to let their identity be erased. However, the emotional shadow of the Trail of Tears remained present in daily life. Survivors and their descendants carried a deep awareness that their nation had been forced to rebuild from near destruction. Every cultural tradition preserved became a quiet act of resistance against the historical forces that had tried to eliminate them. The Cherokee Nation had survived removal, betrayal, and generational trauma. But as decades passed, new federal policies aimed at controlling Native American communities were already forming. Policies that would once again threaten Cherokee identity, culture, and survival in ways that would reopen wounds many thought had begun to heal. By the late 1800s, the Cherokee Nation had rebuilt much of what was destroyed during the Trail of Tears. They established schools, a functioning government, and growing communities across their new territory. Farms began producing stable food supplies. Businesses slowly emerged. For the first time in decades, Cherokee families felt a fragile sense of stability returning. But the United States government had not abandoned its mission to control Native American nations. A new set of federal policies began targeting tribal sovereignty across the country. Officials believed Native American communities should abandon their cultural systems and fully adopt American lifestyles. To many policymakers, the goal was not coexistence, it was assimilation. One of the most devastating strategies introduced during this period was the creation of Native American boarding schools. Government authorities began removing Native children from their families and sending them to distant institutions designed to erase tribal identity. These schools were often located hundreds of miles away from Native communities, making family visits nearly impossible.
Children arriving at these schools faced immediate cultural transformation. Their traditional clothing was taken away and replaced with uniforms. Long hair, which held deep spiritual significance in Cherokee culture, was cut short. Native languages were strictly forbidden. Students caught speaking Cherokee were punished through isolation, physical discipline, or deprivation of food and privileges. School administrators followed a harsh philosophy summarized by a chilling phrase: "Kill the Indian, save the man." The intention was clear: eliminate Native identity and replace it with American cultural norms. Many Cherokee parents had no legal power to stop their children from being taken. Federal authorities often forced enrollment through threats, military pressure, or withholding government support. Families who had already lost relatives during the Trail of Tears now faced losing their children to institutions that aimed to reshape their entire identity. The emotional damage caused by boarding schools extended far beyond the classroom. Children raised in these environments often grew disconnected from their language, traditions, and family structures. When they eventually returned home, some struggled to communicate with their parents and elders. The generational knowledge that had survived forced removal now faced another threat from within. Reports from former students later described severe loneliness, emotional abuse, and harsh discipline inside many boarding schools. Some children died from disease outbreaks or poor living conditions. Others attempted escape, risking severe punishment if captured. Despite these pressures, Cherokee communities fought to preserve their culture. Families secretly taught language and traditions at home. Elders continued storytelling gatherings away from government observation.
Spiritual ceremonies were practiced quietly, protecting traditions from being completely erased. The Cherokee Nation also used political channels to resist assimilation policies. Tribal leaders advocated for educational systems that allowed Native children to learn modern skills while maintaining cultural identity. These efforts sparked ongoing battles between federal authorities and tribal governments over educational control. The long-term consequences of boarding school policies deeply affected Cherokee society. Generations grew up struggling to reconnect with their heritage. Family structures weakened as cultural knowledge was interrupted. Emotional trauma spread quietly through communities already scarred by forced removal.
Yet survival remains stronger than destruction. Cherokee activists, educators, and spiritual leaders worked tirelessly to revive language programs, cultural education, and community healing initiatives. Their efforts ensured that Cherokee identity would not disappear despite decades of federal pressure. Still, the Trail of Tears had created a cycle of suffering that extended far beyond one forced march. Each new government policy reopened historical wounds, reminding Cherokee communities that their survival was a continuous struggle rather than a completed victory. And as the Cherokee Nation entered the modern era, a new challenge was emerging, one that would force them to fight not only for cultural survival, but also for legal recognition, land protection, and historical justice that had been denied for nearly 2 centuries. As the 20th century unfolded, the Cherokee Nation and other Native American tribes entered a new battlefield, the fight for legal recognition, land protection, and historical justice. The physical Trail of Tears had ended nearly a century earlier, but its consequences continued shaping Native American life across generations. For decades, federal policies had stripped Native tribes of land, political authority, and economic stability. The Cherokee Nation faced repeated attempts by the United States government to dissolve tribal governments entirely. These efforts aimed to absorb Native communities into state systems, removing their sovereignty and weakening their ability to self-govern. One of the most controversial policies emerged during the late 1800s and early 1900s through the Dawes Act. This law divided tribal lands into individual family allotments, breaking apart large communal territories that had sustained Native cultures for centuries. Land that remained after allotment was often sold to non-Native settlers. The impact on Cherokee territory was devastating. Large portions of tribal land were permanently lost through forced sales, fraud, and legal manipulation. Families who once depended on shared land systems found themselves isolated and economically vulnerable. The policy aimed to reshape Native identity into individual land ownership structures aligned with American farming traditions. Instead, it fractured tribal unity and accelerated land loss.
By the early 20th century, the Cherokee Nation's political authority had been severely weakened. Federal officials attempted to dismantle tribal governments, claiming Native nations no longer needed independent leadership. This created a period of political silence where Cherokee citizens struggled to organize or advocate for their rights effectively. But Cherokee resistance never disappeared. During the mid-1900s, Native American civil rights movements began gaining momentum across the United States. Cherokee activists joined broader indigenous efforts demanding restoration of tribal sovereignty, cultural protection, and legal recognition. These movements used public demonstrations, political lobbying, and legal challenges to confront federal policies that had suppressed Native authority for generations. The struggle was long and exhausting. Cherokee leaders worked to rebuild tribal governance structures, reestablish constitutional authority, and restore federal recognition of their political rights. Cultural programs expanded, focusing on language preservation, historical education, and spiritual renewal. Communities began openly teaching younger generations about the Trail of Tears and other historical injustices that had shaped their nation's survival. Legal battles became one of the most important tools in the fight for justice. Throughout the 20th century, Cherokee representatives brought cases before federal courts, challenging land seizures, treaty violations, and government overreach. These cases required years of legal preparation, historical documentation, and political negotiation. While victories were slow and often incomplete, each success restored pieces of Cherokee sovereignty that had been stripped away. Public awareness also began changing. Historians, educators, and cultural institutions started documenting Native American history more accurately, bringing events like the Trail of Tears into national discussions. Memorials, museums, and educational programs helped ensure that the suffering endured by the Cherokee people would no longer be ignored or forgotten. Still, emotional wounds from forced removal, cultural suppression, and land loss remained deeply rooted within Cherokee communities. Many survivors' descendants continued seeking acknowledgement and respect for their ancestors' suffering. Healing required more than legal recognition. It required preserving memory and honoring resilience. By the late 20th century, the Cherokee Nation had regained significant political authority and established strong educational, cultural, and economic programs supporting its citizens.
Their survival stood as proof of extraordinary endurance against centuries of pressure designed to erase their identity. Yet, the story of the Trail of Tears was far from just a chapter in history books. Its legacy continued influencing Native American rights, cultural preservation efforts, and national conversations about justice and reconciliation. And as modern Cherokee communities carried forward their ancestors' memory, a powerful question remained. How would future generations ensure that the lessons of the Trail of Tears were never forgotten by the world? Today, nearly 2 centuries after the Trail of Tears, the echoes of that tragic journey still live within the Cherokee Nation and across Native American communities throughout the United States. The forced march may exist in history books, but for many Cherokee families, it remains a living memory passed through generations of storytelling, cultural preservation, and remembrance. The Trail of Tears was never just about relocation, it was about survival against overwhelming odds. It was about a nation forced to walk away from ancestral land, sacred traditions, and thousands of loved ones, yet still refusing to disappear. Modern Cherokee communities have transformed pain into strength. Across Oklahoma and other parts of the United States, Cherokee citizens had built thriving educational systems, healthcare programs, cultural preservation centers, and economic enterprises that support their people. The Cherokee Nation is now one of the largest and most influential Native American tribes in the country, demonstrating resilience that few civilizations in history have matched. Language revitalization has become one of the most powerful symbols of survival. Cherokee educators and elders work tirelessly to teach younger generations the Cherokee language, ensuring that voices nearly silenced by forced assimilation continue to be heard. Cultural festivals, storytelling gatherings, and spiritual ceremonies now serve as reminders that identity cannot be erased through force. The Trail of Tears is also being remembered through national recognition. Historical sites along the original migration routes have been preserved as memorial trails. Museums and cultural centers document survivor accounts, photographs, and oral histories that describe the journey in heartbreaking detail. Visitors who walk sections of the preserved trail today often describe feeling a deep emotional connection to the suffering endured by those who traveled it nearly 200 years ago. These memorials serve a critical purpose. They prevent silence from rewriting history. Educational programs across the United States now include lessons about the Trail of Tears, allowing students to understand how government policies once caused massive human suffering. For many Americans, learning about this tragedy challenges long-standing national narratives and encourages deeper reflection about justice, cultural respect, and historical accountability. Still, remembrance remains deeply personal for Cherokee families. Many descendants carry stories passed down from ancestors who survived the march. Some families preserve heirlooms carried during the journey, blankets, tools, or sacred objects that traveled thousands of miles alongside their ancestors. These items serve as emotional bridges connecting modern generations to their history of survival. The Trail of Tears also stands as a global symbol of resilience. It reminds the world that cultural identity can survive even when faced with displacement, violence, and systematic attempts at erasure. The Cherokee people transformed unimaginable tragedy into determination, rebuilding a nation while honoring those who never reached the journey's end. But remembrance is not just about honoring the past. It is about ensuring future generations understand the cost of injustice and the value of cultural preservation. The Trail of Tears remains a warning about what happens when power is placed above humanity, when promises are broken, and when entire communities are forced to sacrifice their existence. The footsteps of over 16,000 Cherokee men, women, and children still echo through American history. More than 4,000 lives were lost along that frozen road, but their story continues guiding conversations about truth, respect, and resilience.
Their journey did not end in 1839. It continues every time their story is told, every time their culture is preserved, and every time history is remembered honestly. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered and shared, make sure you subscribe to Canon of Darkness and stay with us as we continue uncovering history's forgotten shadows, because some stories must never be allowed to fade into silence. History often treats tragedies like they are finished events, moments that begin, explode into suffering, and then quietly fade into the past. But the Trail of Tears never truly ended. Its impact still moves through American history like a shadow that refuses to disappear, shaping conversations about justice, identity, and the responsibility of remembering uncomfortable truths. For the Cherokee Nation, the Trail of Tears is not simply a story about loss. It is a reminder of survival against forces that nearly erased an entire civilization. Every Cherokee generation that followed carried the responsibility of protecting traditions, language, and history that were once nearly destroyed. Today, Cherokee communities continue growing stronger while honoring their past. Modern Cherokee leaders focus heavily on education, healthcare, and cultural preservation, ensuring their citizens have opportunities that earlier generations could only dream about. Cherokee schools now teach both modern academic subjects and traditional cultural knowledge, allowing students to understand their heritage while preparing for the future. Cultural preservation programs have expanded beyond local communities. Cherokee language courses are now taught through digital platforms, universities, and community programs across the United States.
These efforts represent a powerful reversal of history, transforming a language once punished in boarding schools into a symbol of pride and survival. Economic development has also helped strengthen Cherokee independence. Tribal businesses, tourism programs, and community enterprises support thousands of Cherokee families. Cultural centers and museums attract visitors from around the world who want to learn about Cherokee history, including the Trail of Tears.
But perhaps the most powerful legacy of the Trail of Tears is the way it has changed national conversations about indigenous rights. The story forced Americans to confront difficult questions about government power, broken treaties, and the cost of expansion. Over time, recognition of Native American history has grown, encouraging stronger legal protections for tribal sovereignty and cultural preservation. While challenges still exist, many Native communities now have stronger voices in political and cultural decision-making. Commemorative events held across the United States continue honoring those who walked the deadly trail. Annual remembrance ceremonies bring together Cherokee citizens, historians, and visitors who walk sections of the preserved route. These walks are not only memorials, they are acts of cultural resilience, reminding participants that survival itself is a form of victory. The Trail of Tears also teaches a universal lesson that extends far beyond Cherokee history. It shows how easily fear, greed, and political ambition can lead to human suffering when empathy is ignored. It reminds future generations that justice delayed can create wounds lasting centuries. For many Cherokee families, telling the story of the Trail of Tears remains a sacred responsibility. Elders continue sharing survivor accounts, ensuring younger generations understand both the tragedy and the resilience that followed. These stories are not told to hold on to anger, but to preserve truth and honor the ancestors who endured unimaginable hardship. The footsteps of those 16,000 Cherokee travelers still echo through American history. Every preserved story, every spoken word of the Cherokee language, and every cultural tradition practiced today continues the journey that began nearly 2 centuries ago. The Trail of Tears is not just a historical event, it is a living reminder of how survival, identity, and resilience can outlast even the darkest chapters of human history. And if stories like this remind you how important it is to uncover the truths hidden within history's shadows, make sure you subscribe to Canon of Darkness and stay with us for more untold stories that shaped the world we live in today. Because some forgotten footsteps are still walking beside us, waiting to be heard.